I was feverishly writing some notes. I was like, scrap the whole plan. I'm not going to scrap my plan. I'm too anxious for that. So yeah, I am really excited though to dive into some of these questions with you. I think we have something in common that I didn't realize, which is that I'm also a lifelong organizer. I started organizing and doing activism when I was 7 years old on largely environmental justice issues in upstate New York. So, and then have largely been involved in like the climate justice space, as Callie mentioned. So as a result, though, when you made this decision to go to Davos, that article was like all over my social media feed. A lot of people have so many opinions about it. And so I was trying to put myself in your shoes, though, and really think about, like, what are the things that I would be weighing to make this decision? And so, like, on the one hand, as you mentioned, it's, like, the most elite space in the world, and you have people who are literally making these decisions about, like, you know, the ways in which we can live and the quality of that life. And there's, you know, the possibility to, like, be in these rooms and even just hear what they're saying, let alone this possibility for discussion, is like super amazing and alluring. And on the other hand, you know, like these folks are pouring billions of dollars into our electoral systems and undermining our democracies, and at the expense so that they can, you know, continue to make as much money as possible. But, you know, like thinking about those things, that is basically always the tension that we hold when we are invited into centers of power. And so obviously there's like a million directions that we could go in talking about Davos, but I really want to have a conversation that I feel like you're probably not having with other folks, which is I want to know like how you felt in that space, like what was happening inside your body, like how were you holding that tension? Like, how are you grounding yourself? Like, what was the emotional landscape of Micah White?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Thank you for demonstrating curiosity about these things. Yeah, I mean, it was definitely like, so if you haven't read, so what the funny thing about that article, this is article, I mean, I wrote an article, I told the people at the World Economic Forum that it was reputational suicide. I wrote an article for them saying it was reputational suicide, but of course, no one reads the World Economic Forum's blog. And so the CNN guy, yeah, so, right? So it's like it went under the radar and whatever. And then the CNN Business, what happened? CNN Business was like, can you write an article about how you're going to Davos? And I was like, sure. And I wrote the article. They replied, no, we want an article that's like, you know, income inequality is bad. These people are really bad people. Like, can you just give us that? And I was like, no. So I turned around and I gave it to The Guardian. So the reason, there's some things about that article that provoked people. Number one, in a subtle way, it's written for a business audience. I wrote it specifically for an audience of like business people who are not activists. So that I think also triggered people. And then there's also this thing in there that triggers people, which is that it's very easy to say no to Davos until you've been invited, right? Which is something that really triggered people, right? I don't write the headlines and the subheads of these articles. People like assume that I do, but I do not. And so it made people very upset, I think, precisely because there's an ethos within activism that we shouldn't have exclusionary spaces and we shouldn't go to exclusionary spaces, right? What's wrong about elite spaces is precisely that they are spaces that don't allow everyone in. And Davos is a space that, most people on Earth will never get to go. Totally. And even I, who went, I still didn't really go to the real Davos. People say you have to go 5 times before you find the real Davos. I mean, there's these certain parties you have to get invited to. It takes years. But back to your question. So and it kicked up all this negativity, and it was very hard to and very hurtful because I'm a very private person, and actually most people. What's funny is most people like this. People would have to take up these like exaggerated stories from like 10 years ago because actually no one knows me. So it's like a really, especially since Occupy, I really have like closed myself off from a lot of people. So that was part of it. So the emotional experience. I would just say that it took a lot of training in order to get into that space. So after Occupy, I've been invited to give talks in a lot of different spaces that made me very uncomfortable. Spaces that made me even more uncomfortable than Davos, actually. I gave this one talk in, first of all, I gave a talk. I basically, if people invite me, I usually say yes. There's we can get into the reasons why, but I personally believe that evil people can't actually they can't hear what I'm saying. As I believe this. This is from like
Totally.
a Sufi, a Rumi poem, basically, that they're incapable of applying the knowledge that they gain from the talk. It's just through organizational structure, culture, et cetera, whatever. So I gave a talk that I didn't talk publicly about, but I gave a talk at Philip Morris. I gave a talk at an Austrian bankers conference, and I went to this dinner with them, and I just literally felt like it was a bunch of vampires. Like, it was completely uncomfortable. So all of that turned out to be wonderful training for going to Davos.
Yeah.
Davos, which has a dress code, so I had to get, people are like, he's a grifter. They love this word, grifter. I'm like, God, you have no idea. I had to ask for money to buy a suit. Like, I don't have any money. So I had to get foundation that had given me money in the past. Can I have some more money so I can buy a suit? Because they make you wear a suit. Okay, yes. So I buy a suit, all this ridiculous stuff to dress like them so they can hear you, whatever. So the internal experience is that this is why activists are going to lose, because this is why activist culture is broken. When you say something in Davos that they disagree with, they ask you to tell them more. They're fascinated. They're fascinated by different ideas. That's why they brought me. They're like, wow, I've never heard that before. When you say something to activists that they disagree with or haven't heard before, they shut it down. That's the end. That's horrible. You're out of here. It's completely broken. Cancel culture. It's horrible. Yeah. And I think so I'm, on the one hand, the seduction of the World Economic Forum in Davos really is that it's a space where people are like very curious, actually. They're extremely curious. There's other traits. I met all these not a lot, but I met a few CEOs there, and I just noticed they have a tremendous capacity to absorb new ideas. Like, I would say something to them in one session, and then I would hear them saying a version of that in the next session. And I'm like, their strength comes from their ability to assimilate difference, not push it away. So that was my inner experience, was just feeling like, wow, people are listening, they're hearing, they may not agree. I remember sometimes you sit next to these people, and you tell them you're an activist, and this look on their face is just they're like, what are you, what?
Like, why?
What? Why? Yeah, not only why, it's what? And then they're like, well, how's Occupy going? I'm like, yeah, you guys defeated it. And they're like, oh, okay. And so it's just but at the same time, they listen. So that, a lot of it was I would say many years of training coupled with they have a culture of kind of drawing in difference.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's really fascinating. I did not anticipate that being a feature of the CEO class. Moving on to climate change, which is the topic I'm super excited to talk with you about. One thing that I wrote down as you were talking was that, having been involved in the climate justice movement for a really long time, I think, because the climate justice movement is more of an intersectional movement inherently, it deals specifically with how climate change directly and disproportionately impacts people of color and indigenous communities. And so I've always seen climate change as this real opportunity, actually, to address other social issues while addressing climate change. And that's because where climate change comes from is this exploitation of land and people. And so in order to stop the effects of climate change, we really do need to stop the exploitation of land and people, in my opinion. But you mentioned the space that's created to have these, to introduce the Climate Manifesto and to have this conversation with activists and the two corporations around climate change. And with the Economic Forum being such an exclusive environment, I'm really curious about what the demographics of that space were, how white it was. Were there people from directly impacted communities, like indigenous communities, Black and brown communities, present there? And I'm especially interested in this as many communities who are most directly impacted by climate change have been at the forefront of developing policy and tangible solutions to the climate crisis with an equity and justice lens. And so I'm hoping you can share a bit about if those voices were present and if there were any points that were brought up that really stuck with you.
Yeah. Okay, that's a great question. I think so. The first thing about, there's a lot to say about that, but the first thing to say is that, so this was the 50th anniversary of the forum, so it's a big deal for them. And if you go and expose yourself to the World Economic Forum's propaganda, but if you go and look at their highlights reel from this year's thing, which is the interviews that they did with everyone snipped together, it's all about climate. This year's session was all about climate. I went to some very intense sessions about climate. I'm very into this Trillion Tree campaign, which they've also endorsed. Trump has endorsed. So I went to a planning session for that. I also want to just tell you briefly, I went to this one thing that was super interesting. I went to this one thing that was a session led by this like person at the S&P, which is like the S&P 500. They rank all these companies and all this kind of. So what they've done, so what I'm saying is activists need to up their game in the sense that we assume that the people in power haven't heard our critique and have not responded to our critique. They absolutely have heard the critique and they are literally absorbing the critique. So what they've done, they agree, climate emergency. They absolutely agree. So what this guy did is he showed us this visualization on this huge screen. They partnered with the Carnegie Mellon University. They mapped all of the assets owned by the 500 largest companies in America, all the assets around the world, and then they overlaid visualizations of all the different climate impacts. So for example, how will the assets of S&P 500 companies be impacted by wildfire, by flood, by this, by that, in order to get a sense of the economic costs. They absolutely agree it's an emergency. So the one thing that they said I'd say is concerning is, so he layers up, he goes, okay, let's zoom into like Miami. He zooms in on this map on Miami and there's all these blue dots of all the real estate assets owned by S&P 500. He's like, okay, if there's a 1.5 meter sea level rise, which is like a really conservative estimate, all of these things are going to be underwater. But then he said, the cost of protecting these buildings is equal to the cost of them being destroyed. So there's no economic incentive for them to mitigate climate, the destruction in, for example, Miami. So it's super interesting. So I would say that they're all about climate. They believe in the climate emergency. But I would say that my sense is that there is a strong portion of them who are preparing for defeat, absolutely, and that they think. Actually, the World Economic Forum releases this global risks report, and this year climate was the top 5 risks. And one of them, the largest risks, was failure of climate mobilization. So I absolutely agree, failure of climate mobilization, and that failure is due to both sides, activist culture and corporate culture. So we can't be like, they're the ones, that's their problem. No, I disagree. There's an activist culture represented by the inability to even contemplate what would be necessary to actually do massive mitigation efforts. This is why I like the Trillion Tree campaign. So to your point about did they have indigenous people yes, they did. Yes, they did. They had, whether or not you think they're valid representatives, but the meeting I went to this high-level meeting about the Trillion Tree campaign. In the room was not only like the Saudi finance minister, Jane Goodall was there, but also like this, the UN representative of indigenous peoples was there. She represents millions of indigenous people around the world. There was like a yogi mystic there. Yes, absolutely. I was there. Like they absolutely are trying to incorporate, because they're very results oriented. This is another thing about activism. Activism is not results oriented at all. Failure does not mean we get fired as activists. It doesn't. Okay, failure, if you're a corporation, means you lose, right? So they're very results oriented, and so they're willing to do the things that they think are necessary to get the results that they need. And if that includes having Michael White there or this person who's an indigenous rights rep, whatever, they'll do it. You know what I mean? So that's what I would say.
I think it's really fascinating, the failure of climate mobilization, and this is kind of off my script. I think in large part a lot of that is actually due not just because of climate activists, but because of the foundations that fund us. And I think that the foundation community has really placed an emphasis on more about these large scale actions that are super flashy, and then repeating the same thing. So we had the People's Climate March, and that was super huge and it was amazing. It was super diverse and incredible. And then they were like, round 2. And it's why? Why would we do that again? Let's innovate, let's change, let's keep, yes, that was beautiful, let's do something else. But I think it's this idea of well, this was a thing that was effective once, so let's keep doing it.
Absolutely.
So one of the things, you mentioned the United Front, and you wrote in your manifesto about the United Front, and you give a mandate, I think, in that, to both activists and to industry and government, and I just wanted to read that out. So for industry and governments, this means giving free rein to climate protesters by enacting a global moratorium on suppressing climate protest movements, providing a universal basic income for climate activists, and legislating a prohibition on climate change denial, which has also been a huge hurdle to overcome in the climate change movement. So yeah, I really think that that's really on point. And I also, though, I think that one thing that I found lacking in this point, but also more broadly in the manifesto, is the mention of fossil fuels. And so fossil fuels meaning dirty energy like coal, oil, and gas. It just like never appears in the manifesto. And the highlighted, the section I just read, gives the impression that the main institutions who are most responsible for this massive crisis that we're all experiencing is the need to ensure the right to protest. And I think that the right to protest should absolutely be safeguarded, because as crisis and chaos ensues, like those are usually the first rights to go. But I don't think this goes far enough in a mandate for these institutions. In my experience in the US climate movement, the protests that we have actually largely go unscathed, unlike the Black Lives Matter movement. However, it's often when communities of color and indigenous communities are trying to stop fossil fuel expansion projects that they're met with state violence. And this is like, you can think of Standing Rock, you can think of the Keystone XL pipeline as it was being built in the southern part of this country. And, so here's the sticking point for me. For industry and governments, their biggest mandate is to be cooperative in stopping the burning of fossil fuels and stopping the pollution that disproportionately and devastatingly impacts indigenous, Black, brown, and poor white communities. And so this mandate around fossil fuels obviously has like a super big impact on business as usual and these corporations and their abilities to keep making, billions of dollars. So I'm interested to learn if this was like intentionally left out for the space at Davos, or if this is like what your thought process is around the, issue of fossil fuels in particular, and if that also did just like come up in conversation in the room and what that was like.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a couple things. First, I would say that, to be fair, like the manifesto does start by talking about how we need a 7.6 reduction of carbon emissions per year, each year for 10 years, which is like an insane goal. Seemed insane again, but now, wow, coronavirus, like the sick thing about it is the carbon emissions, the carbon decrease from coronavirus it's unprecedented. I mean, it's a horrible thing.
People
but
just not traveling.
Absolutely. The number of travel down, the factories closed, like there's no one's done a systemic study, but probably the carbon reduction from coronavirus has been moves us much closer to reaching our goal. Okay, but that aside, so the specific thing that I'm trying to argue is that is a limited goal, okay? Which is the following. Scientists say we have 10 years to do this dramatic reduction. So by the end of this decade, we will know whether or not, apparently, humanity is doomed or saved.
Yeah.
Like it's that clear. And the reduction that's necessary, so they say 7.6% per year for 10 years, but it actually works out to being like a 50% reduction so like an insane, think about, basically, imagine all of us driving 50% less, all the corporations, the 50% reduction, so it's insane. So, but they also have there's this idea floating around that if we could plant 1 trillion trees, then 1 trillion trees would absorb 10 years worth of carbon, basically buying humanity 10 years. When I first read about this idea in The Guardian like 9 months ago or 6 months ago or something, I was instantly like, this is a fantastic idea. I love this idea so much for reasons that elites, so later I've discovered the World Economic Forum, I started writing about it, not because of me, but independently of me, the World Economic Forum endorsed it. Trump has endorsed it because Jared Kushner's into the idea. And then I also found out at Davos is that the G20, if nothing changes, is going to endorse it as well at the end of this year. So the powers are all orienting around, okay, fine, we're going to do a massive tree planting and reforestation effort. Yes, they're not going to just plant the same trees. Yes, they're going to work with indigenous people. This is all like part of their plan. But what I like about it, the reason why I like it, is because in order to pull that off, even by the estimates of the World Economic Forum, they need hundreds of millions of people on the grassroots level. So we're talking like a social movement beyond anything that we've ever seen, like 10 times bigger than Occupy Wall Street, facilitated by governments around the world, paid for by corporations, and created by activists, basically. This is what we're imagining. That is the limited goal. That planting of the trees, the reason why I want the planting of the trees is because it's a Trojan horse. Because in order to achieve that, it will be suspension of the status quo. They'll have to like give us time off, all this kind of, if they're serious about it, if they're actually serious about it, then they will have to do those things. That's what I want. So that leaves aside, yes, it absolutely tables all of the other things about, yeah, oil companies are still going to exist. All this kind of stuff is still going to happen. It's not a solution. It's like a thing to achieve that will, if achieved, result in social changes that I would like to see happen. Okay, like I want to, and I was like talking to my wife about this too. Actually, is like I think also what's fascinating about the coronavirus is that it's a suspension of the status quo. That's what I really want. I just want this world that we all are in right now to just like stop, and then for everyone to be like, tree planting, okay, or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't have, no one has to work anymore. That's what I want. And in different times in human history, we've actually had that. Like, if you look at the number of holidays that they would have in ancient Rome, it was like, I think it was like something like 1 out of 3 days was like a vacation day or something. It's crazy. You know what I mean? They had paid for vacation. Anyway, so that's what I'm interested in. So absolutely, I agree with you that it's not a silver bullet. The other thing that I will say is that the World Economic Forum is a limited space. Like, oil companies aren't there. This is another thing that's interesting. We assume that the most evil people on earth are there, but actually they too have their own criteria, and there are companies who are too evil for them to let in. Oil companies and tobacco companies are allowed into the World Economic Forum. Everyone who's there is supposed to be a company who's trying to improve the state of the world. So that's part of it too.
Yeah, it's interesting, the tree aspect, because I am also really into this idea. I think it's I think anything that gets us working collaboratively together is going to be really important, not just for the actual emissions reductions, but also for the act of collaboration and teaching us tangible skills of how to do these things. And then also, like, what does it mean to like not go to work and have companies be okay with that? But I think also on that front, we are also seeing unprecedented violence against land defenders. We've had over 100 people in the last year were murdered, and those are people who are defending the land, who are indigenous. And one of the biggest ways that we can actually reduce carbon emissions is by enshrining the production of indigenous peoples, who are the stewards of a lot of these forests. So that's everywhere from Canada to the Philippines to Ecuador. Like, we're seeing unprecedented violence, and we're also seeing that is some of our best ways. So in addition to planting new trees, we also have to protect the old growth forest that contains so much more carbon than what the new trees capacity would be able to do. Yeah. So that's just like an aside on that. My last question is around organizing and revolution. I've gotten, to read a little bit more about your work in the last few days, and it's been a real pleasure to think and take a break and think more about social change and revolution. My family's Lebanese, and I think, as you're probably aware, we're in the midst of a massive political revolution right now in Lebanon. And I was there for the 10 days after the revolution started, for about a month. And it's overwhelmingly clear to me that we have so much to learn from revolutions and from these moments where people come together in this persistent and ongoing way. And especially in the era of the internet, where things can be organized super fast, where these moments that would have normally gone unnoticed become these flashpoints for re-engagement. And re-engagement's super crucial, because the nature of a revolution is that it just doesn't happen overnight. So you have to keep showing up, and you get tired. And so I came back super exhausted and depleted, but also paradoxically completely enlivened and re-inspired, and feeling that absolutely we need something like this, not only here but obviously everywhere. So one thing though that you mentioned is that we don't know how these things happen, what it actually takes to create the conditions for people to come out in mass in the streets. And so I'm curious about what you think the role of organizing, which I think is different from activism, the ongoing relationship building, working with like the communities themselves, like developing solutions, figuring out what our communities need and making that happen, and then scaling those solutions. So yeah, I'm curious about like what you think about organizing as it relates, especially to laying the foundation for revolution.
Okay, that's a great question. I'm laughing because now it's like, oh boy, I'm gonna get in trouble because this is one of those tough areas. So I think there's a couple. So two things I want to say first, because one thing before I get into that question, because I think it's really important, is that I just want to say that like I think unlike previous times when activists sought to have a sense of kind of purity and clarity, I think that now we're in a moment of like really tough decisions. Okay, and so I absolutely agree with your comment about like activists, environmental activists are getting killed. Like they just had like in the last, it's like they're not reporting it very much, but if you read The Guardian, like they do talk about it a little bit, not even fully, but like two people just got killed protecting like monarch butterfly habitat. Like
it's like every 4 days.
Yeah, it's insane. It's really insane. It's not being covered, and it's really crazy. And I absolutely agree with you. But at the same time, I think what I want to say is that the decision that's being offered to activists right now and why it's so difficult is basically this idea that the founder of the World Economic Forum, I asked him directly, like, is revolution still possible, or do we need to get rid of the concept of revolution and stuff? And his answer was he likes to speak in kind of, I don't know, mystical phrases. I felt like he was a very enlightened person, actually. But his response was that we can no longer have a change of systems, but we can have systems change. Okay, it's very interesting. So what he's saying is that he says a change of systems. There is no alternative to capitalism, but we can have a different capitalism. This is for him the structure of the collaboration. And he talks a lot about friendship.
Yeah.
So the basis of the friendship for him is systems change. He's all about it. Change of systems, not possible. Now, the activist in me is like, I'm fine with that because at a certain point, systems change becomes a change of systems. So I'm fine with that. But that's the contour of the debate. So what I'm saying is that we're entering into a messy time where it's like, yes, environmental activists are being killed in South America. Yes, we're now working with people who are our enemies. Like, that's the messy situation in which we are in. Because when we're chasing purity, we're not going to get there in time. That's, I think, the real
I completely agree. I don't think we should be chasing purity. I think that we should be continually advocating for the solutions that we need, that are crucial to our survival. And so I totally agree with you, because I think that we do need to throw everything at this. But I think that if we also see that a solution is not actually a solution, then we have to be able to say that, like, no, we have a better solution, and it's over here, and like we're going to put all of our energy behind it.
Right, and that would take a tremendous amount of courage for activists to say that, because right now, so I would be very interested to hear an activist organization come up with an alternative solution to planting 1 trillion trees that didn't. Basically, I'd be interested in any solution that they could put forward that doesn't involve working with elites, because I think the scale of the problem literally makes that is impossible.
I don't think, personally, in my experience, I don't think climate activists or climate organizations are hesitant or like opposed, is the word I was looking for, to working with elites. I mean, most of the major organizations have like loved their relationship with power. They love being invited into the White House and talking with whoever's in power, if they're not Donald Trump. And so, like, I do believe that we will be able to do that, but I do think that, like, if we have solutions that seem like solutions but are not, that we need to hold a firm line. Like, if they're actually going to put more indigenous people in danger and like destroy many of the old growth forests and our jungles that are like essential to our survival, then those aren't solutions. But I don't think that's what you're proposing with the 1 trillion trees.
No. But I hear your point. So, but going on to this thing about organizing versus activism. So, I mean, I consider myself an activist, not an organizer. And they're very different. So organizing. I do this thing called Activist Graduate School, which is like an online school for activists. And our second course we taught at UCLA about housing justice. and the room was like, they're all organizers and not activists. So I constantly was getting into trouble because there's a lot of like all of activism has like orthodoxy and belief systems that are unarticulated. And then when you step over them, you get in trouble. And organizers have them too. And one of the things that organizers believe is that the people most affected by a problem should be the ones to come up with a solution to it, which sounds really good. But when you're dealing with something like housing, it's like, sort of, because the people who are it doesn't quite work. Basically, like we're in this weird world where like the impacts that we're experiencing locally are sometimes caused by global forces that live very far from us, and we actually are experiencing traumas whose cause is very far away and inexplicable to us on the local level. Anyways, this got them very annoyed, this idea of it. But what I would say is, like, for me, the defining difference is that, and if you look at how Occupy was created, it was just an idea that was contagious. And people who built it are the ones who believed in the idea. It's a lot like Christianity. It was a spiritual movement because it was a prophetic movement based around like people believing in this idea. There was no coercion and there was no organizing, really. I mean, we didn't go and say like, you guys should join Occupy Wall Street. People joined Occupy Wall Street because they'd be walking down the street, they'd see an encampment, they would stop for a minute, and all of a sudden they'd become like core organizers. So there's a lot of benefits to that style of organizing, of activism, which is basically low overhead. You basically, and as an activist, what I try to do is I try to create compelling ideas, put them out there, and hope they get taken up by other people, right? It's less labor intensive. Organizing, I think, is also necessary and serves different purposes, but both have their downsides. I would say the downside of activism is that it is dependent on basically, I would say downside of activism is that the people who take up the idea, you don't choose them, and so they come with their own baggage. So a lot of the problems with Occupy Wall Street were actually inherited because the people who took up the idea in New York City believed certain things that I and the founder of Adbusters did not believe and had never heard of, like prefigurative anarchism being what, that whole idea, prefigurative anarchism, I'd never heard of, and that's one of the reasons why Occupy failed, is prefigurative anarchism. But it's also one of the reasons why it grew, so whatever. So with organizing, the downside of organizing is that it oftentimes puts too much emphasis and pressure on the individual, and it thinks that our failure is the result of like that we didn't organize enough. Like, so if only we had, it's very voluntarist. If only I had organized better, or like talked to more people, or like done more things properly. But it doesn't take, I think what activism excels at is realizing like sometimes ideas catch and sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
Sometimes you talk to someone and they're like, what? I would never join an encampment. And the next minute they're there in the encampment, throwing up, quitting their job. And those are outside of our control. So I do see a really big division between organizing and activism. And I think that I just temperamentally are more drawn to, I'm a very private person, I'm more drawn to activism. And I think they both have their strengths. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So yeah.
Awesome. Well, those are all my questions. Do we have questions from folks?
Yeah, we've got 3. You might have addressed a little bit that one.
Okay.
You want to continue?
Cool. Ooh. Yeah, we just sort of did that one. It was around like the alliance of opposites and connecting to local organizing. So I don't know if you want to specifically talk about the alliance of opposites.
Well, I just want to say one thing about that, which I think is like, I do think that it's hard to think about different scales and whether or not ideas apply at different scales. So there's like one thing about the United Front is like working at a certain scale, and I'm not trying to argue that it necessarily has to be transferred to the local level. Like the local strategy might be different than the global strategy, you know what I mean? So it might be better to continue to pursue, for example, taking political power in Kingston versus forming a united front with the Kingston government, whereas you would still advocate for a united front with like Trump. Like I might be more open to advocating a united front for climate with Trump than the mayor of Kingston, for example, out of strategic like differences over like what can be achieved and stuff. So, yeah.
Totally. Okay. So you mentioned people in Davos listen, and they listen to your ideas. So in that case, what are the things that our communities aren't listening to?
Oh my God. The things that our communities aren't listening to. I mean, look, there's all these unwritten rules, and we all experience them, and I don't think anyone's done a good job. Like if I could, I would write an article where you just go and try to write down what these unwritten rules are. I mean, you discover them through stepping on them.
Yeah.
So one I discovered at UCLA is the people most impacted by a situation are the ones from whom the solution should come. Another one is we don't go to elite spaces. The only reason, so a huge critique that happened because I went to Davos was the only reason he's going to Davos is because he's sold out. That's the only reason someone would go to Davos is to sell out. And I'm like, really? That's the only reason? Like, I went to Davos and then I went to visit Extinction Rebellion. I actually am following this other trajectory, So it's like I can see lots of reasons to go to Davos, Other things that we believe, I think it's hard. It's hard to name them. I mean, they're deep, and you feel them by messing with them. I think a huge one is, can social movements be created? This is a huge thing, and it's like, oh my God, it drives me crazy. It hurts me so much because it's like. One of the benefits of being married to a person for a long time is like she was there. So I can say to her, like, do you see these articles saying, like, they'll literally say things like, he had virtually nothing to do with the creation of Occupy Wall Street. And I'm like, I just want to like lie down and go to sleep. I'm like, I created the first Twitter account. I sent the very first tweet. We called for the name. The reason why Occupy Wall Street started on September 17, 2011, and you can go ask, they don't know. It's because it's Cullen Lassen's mother's birthday. It's like the reason why I started on this day is because the other co-founder's birthday. So there's this idea that no one creates things. And I wrote to this professor, and he wrote this article saying, oh, Micah's a so-called or self-described creator. And I'm like, I'm not self-described. It just is the fact. He's like, no, you may have like come up with the idea, but lots of people found it. I'm like, well, obviously, if you're Apple, like Steve Jobs, no one says you didn't create Apple because there's 10,000 employees under you or whatever. You're like, no, obviously, social enterprises and social movements involve lots of people, but the idea did come from somewhere. And what's most frustrating about it, and this is the last thing I'll say, what's most frustrating about it is that we are the ones who created the idea that the idea didn't come from anywhere. That was the allure of Occupy Wall Street. It's a leaderless social protest, and every time a journalist said to us, can we interview you? We're like, no, interview the people in New York City. Mm-hmm. So we actually created the very narrative that there was no creator. And then, like, when it was over, I was like, actually, there was a creator, and here's people kind of knew. But anyway, so another one is that there are no creators, which is really another one that I think is really hurtful is that no one should be able to live as an activist, like financially.
Oh, yeah.
Like if you make any money as an activist, you're obviously some sort of criminal or a grifter, this word that they use, grifter.
Totally.
And I met this person in Davos. There's a lot of European activists at Davos, actually. And one of them was like, I'm really upset because I wrote this book about climate activism, and then the movement told me I had to give all the money away, but I have nothing to live on. And I was like, yes, this is precisely the problem. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, how are you
absolutely.
It's ridiculous. So, but
Yeah.
and there is a fine line because at the same time, you don't want profiteering. So it's a very difficult thing. So there's a lot of ideas. I mean, I think the way to discover, what I would say is instead of me enumerating what they are, you should go out and discover them through your personal experience as an activist, and then you should enumerate them because they are there, and it's really troubling.
So I think we'll do this question from around Occupy since we were talking about it a bunch. So why call Occupy protests a failure if the inspiration lives on and the concepts still motivate people to create change?
Yeah. Well, because, for a really important reason, which is that I think that one of the things that we do as activists is we lower the definition of success in order to make ourselves kind of feel better, okay? But if we're honest with ourselves, the goal of Occupy Wall Street was to get money out of politics, to give more power to the 99%. Like all of the things that we dreamed of, if you go back and read all the articles that the movement produced, like none of those things were achieved. And so I think the reason, and people got really upset when I called it a failure because there's a kind of culture of, another one of the unwritten rules is like, nothing is a failure. Like everything is a success because, we changed the discourse or we inspired a new generation of activists or like all these things are true, but actually we did not achieve our objective, and that's the definition of failure. So it's not that failing isn't bad, it's just we should be honest. So I think previous revolutionaries have had much a more honest relationship with failure. Like there's that famous Mao thing about, try, fail, try again, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But so like, that's a large part of it. It's just, I think calling it a failure is necessary in order to ascertain whether or not we are achieving what we're trying to achieve. But that doesn't mean that good things didn't come out of it. Absolutely. Like the 10 years prior to Occupy basically created a whole new wave of social protest. in the last 10 years have been all these successive social protests, largely because of Occupy and the Arab Spring. Like that's what kicked off all of that thing. So yeah, it was a good thing, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, yeah, the ability to be able to see how, you know, like the narrative was changed
Yes.
afterward. I think that that was a huge success. But I can get what you mean around being clear around failure, and especially like being able to achieve one's goals.
Yeah.
So that like then there's an honest conversation about what we can learn and how we can change. And
Yes.
obviously it's like very hard to discern like how social movements happen or grow and
Yeah.
change. But
And I would just add one more thing on there, which is really important, which is that one of the things that they did with Occupy is that the very forces who kind of came later to call it a success were not the ones who were there in the beginning.
Right.
So the progressive establishment in the first 2 years completely ignored Occupy, and then they jumped on the bandwagon, and then they become the ones who's like, it's a success because you changed the discourse and Bernie Sanders. So like some of the success narrative like really just feeds into the very forces who didn't want Occupy to be a revolutionary movement. They wanted it to be a re-election campaign for Obama, which is what they ended up forcing it to be. But so it's also kind of taking issue with like that whole thing. Yeah.
This question is around climate change. How do we change the narrative around what causes climate change, and how can we move corporations to give up their power and stop impacting the earth?
Yeah, well, I mean, so from my experience at Davos, what I would say is that climate activists have made a lot of progress in terms of they agree there's a climate emergency. They actually had sessions on like avoiding the climate apocalypse, like really like flat out like crazy, yeah, literally like crazy stuff. And you're like, wow, you guys are really using that language. And but you know, I think that what I would say is that I sense that there's some corporations who I think genuinely do want to assist climate change efforts, and partly because they think that that is part of their survival. Mm-hmm. And then I would say that part of the personalized experience of Davos is that I probably was overwhelmingly like given those people to communicate with. Mm-hmm. But I get the sense there's like a large number of people who also already think we failed.
Yeah.
Sometimes I also already think we failed,
Absolutely.
but they're preparing for failure.
Yeah.
And so what I would say is basically like the argument that seems to work on corporations is you need the activists, and partnering with the activists is the only way to save yourself. That doesn't seem to work with the other segment of corporations who think the climate mobilization has already failed. The cost of mitigating climate is too high anyways. So let's just map out what assets are going to be lost and move our resources away from, you know, subtly stop investing in corporations that own Miami. And like, so they're just like preparing for failure. So, which maybe there's going to be a point in like 2 or 3 years where we just do that as activists too. We're like, okay, like, I mean, it's really hard to tell right now with coronavirus, because even when I talk about the Trillion Tree campaign, I just can't see, there's going to be no social protests this year. This might be the first year in a long time. I mean, election years are always really hard for large-scale social protests, but this might be the first year in a long time where there is no large march. There is no large protest, because you can't. I mean, the coronavirus is not going to get stopped. So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's very interesting to see. So that's thrown a lot of the climate stuff, mobilization stuff out of the window. So I'm not sure.
Totally. I have so many thoughts about the climate, but I feel like I need to do justice to these. Okay. Do you think in working with elites, you have to have a clear, strong idea about when and how, so it doesn't get muddy and undermine the credibility of movements and activism?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why I talked about reputational risk. And I mean, what's fascinating is I wrote these things in an article for the WEF and they published it. So I talk about that, which is that, yes, so just being in those spaces decreases the credibility of activists, you know, because of some legitimate and unlegitimate reasons. It happens unevenly though, because a lot of people would say to me like I'd be in the Davos and they'd be like, oh God, I saw that article. Like, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I don't understand why it's okay for Greta to go though. And I'd be like, because Greenpeace is there and Greta's there, and everyone's like, yay! And then Michael White shows up, like, no, you're horrible. You're only there because you're evil. And so there is a really interesting, I don't know if it's like a race thing or that I'm older or whatever, I'm coming from a different movement.
Probably.
But there's like a whole lot of I'm like, Because in some ways it's better for me to go than Greta, because I've been an activist for 25 years, and like
Yeah.
I am much more, I would like to think, thoughtful. I mean, I remember when I was 17, I had no sense of history. So anyways, what I'm saying is Greta, I think,
Yeah.
is more easily co-optable than Micah White. But then the argument somehow is that I'm more co-optable than Greta. I'm like, I don't understand how this is working. Like, I really don't understand.